Imagine wearing the uniform of the most feared organization in human history, the black tunic with the silver skull, the lightning bolts on your collar, and every morning you walk past your own basement door knowing that beneath your feet, hidden in total darkness, breathes a Jewish family whose discovery would mean your execution and theirs. This is not fiction. This is not a Hollywood script. This happened. And the man who did it was not a spy, not a double agent, not someone with a secret plan to betray the Reich. He was Albert Göring, a decorated officer of the SS, and for 3 years he turned his own home into the most dangerous hiding place in Nazi Germany, where one wrong sound, one curious neighbor, one unannounced inspection could end 6 lives in an instant. The question that will haunt you by the end of this video is not how he did it, but why a man sworn to the annihilation of the Jewish people chose to risk everything, including his honor, his family name, and his neck, to save them. Before we dive into the impossible, we need to understand the world Albert Göring lived in, because without that context, you will never grasp the insanity of what he did. It is 1941, and Germany is at the height of its power. The Wehrmacht has conquered most of Europe. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, is no longer just Hitler's personal guard. It has become the instrument of the final solution, the enforcer of racial purity, the executioner of millions. To be part of the SS is not just to be a soldier, it is to be an ideological warrior, a believer in the supremacy of the Aryan race and the extermination of all who threaten it. Every SS officer takes an oath of absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler, and that oath is not symbolic. It is blood, it is iron. It is enforced with terror. In this world, there is no grey area. You are either with the Reich or you are its enemy. There is no middle ground, no room for doubt, and certainly no space for mercy toward the Jewish population, who by 1941 are being systematically rounded up, stripped of their rights, forced into ghettos, and shipped to camps whose true purpose is only whispered about in the darkest corners of the Reich. Albert Göring was born into this world, but not into this ideology. He grew up in Munich, the son of a high-ranking German official, and his childhood was one of privilege, culture, and a certain distance from the fanaticism that would later consume his country. He joined the SS not out of ideological fervor, but out of duty, a sense that every able-bodied German man owed his service to the fatherland. He was good at his job, competent, reliable, the kind of officer who followed orders and did not ask questions. But something inside Albert never fully aligned with the machinery of hate around him. Maybe it was the way his mother had raised him, with a quiet insistence on decency. Maybe it was the Jewish families he had known before the war, the shopkeepers, the musicians, the doctors, who had once been his neighbors. Or maybe it was simply that Albert Göring possessed that rare and dangerous thing in Nazi Germany, a conscience that refused to be silent. By 1942, the deportations in his district had become routine. Families were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, loaded onto trucks, and disappeared. Albert watched. He said nothing. Until one day, he saw something that broke him. A family, the Rosenfelds, who lived 3 blocks from his own house, were being taken. The father was a tailor. The mother was a pianist. They had 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 12. Albert had known them before the laws changed, before the yellow stars, before the fear. And as he watched them being shoved into the back of a truck, their hands bound, their eyes wide with terror, something inside him cracked. He did not know yet what he would do. He only knew that he could not do nothing. That night, Albert made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not fight the system openly. He would not sabotage his unit or defect to the Allies. That would be suicide, and it would save no one. Instead, he would do something far more dangerous. He would use his position, his uniform, his authority as an SS officer, to hide the Rosenfelds in the one place no one would ever think to look: his own basement. He knew the risks. He knew that discovery would mean a trial, a public execution, and the disgrace of his family name. But he also knew that if he walked away, if he let that truck take them to wherever it was going, he would never forgive himself. And so, under the cover of night, Albert Göring became a criminal in the eyes of the Reich. The plan was insane. Albert's home was not some isolated farmhouse in the countryside. It was a modest row house in a residential neighborhood, surrounded by other German families, some of whom were loyal party members. His neighbors knew him. They knew his schedule. They knew he was SS. And now, hidden beneath their feet, were 4 Jewish lives whose every breath depended on absolute silence. The basement was small, damp and lightless. There were no windows, no ventilation, no bathroom. Albert had to smuggle food down to them every night and remove waste in buckets that he buried in his small backyard. The Rosenfelds could not speak above a whisper. They could not move during the day when neighbors might hear footsteps. They could not cough, cry, or make any sound that might alert the world above to their existence. For 3 years they lived like ghosts in the dark. And for 3 years Albert Göring walked the streets in his black uniform, knowing that every knock on his door might be the end. The first week was the hardest, not because of the logistics, but because of the fear. Albert had prepared the basement as best he could, bringing down blankets, a few chairs, some stored food, and a single oil lamp that the Rosenfelds could only light for minutes at a time. But nothing could prepare any of them for the psychological weight of what they had entered into. The Rosenfeld family had gone from a life of relative normalcy, despite the increasingly brutal restrictions, to complete erasure from the world. Officially, they no longer existed. Their names had been crossed off the deportation list, marked as transported, and no one in the Reich bureaucracy would question it. Albert had used his SS credentials to alter the paperwork himself, a forgery that could unravel at any moment if someone decided to audit the records. Upstairs, Albert continued his daily routine. He woke at 6 in the morning, put on his uniform, and reported for duty. He attended briefings, filed reports, and saluted his superiors. He was, by all appearances, a loyal officer of the SS, and that performance had to be flawless, because even a hint of doubt, even a single suspicion, would bring the Gestapo to his door. The neighbors were the most immediate threat. In Nazi Germany, the culture of informing had become almost pathological. Block wardens kept lists of every household, noting who came and who went, who displayed the flag on party holidays, who attended rallies. Children were taught in school to report their own parents if they heard defeatist talk or criticism of the Führer. Albert's neighbor to the left, Herr Krause, was a retired postal worker and a zealous party member who had once reported a grocer for hoarding butter. The neighbor to the right, Frau Weber, was a widow whose son had died on the Eastern Front, and her grief had curdled into a bitter nationalism that made her suspicious of everyone. Albert knew that both of them watched his house, not out of malice necessarily, but out of a sense of duty. Every time he carried a bag of groceries inside, every time he worked late into the night in his small backyard, he could feel their eyes on him. He had to give them nothing, no deviation from routine, no unexplained activity, no reason to wonder. The first close call came in the 3rd week. It was a Sunday morning, and Albert was upstairs preparing a small breakfast when he heard the knock. It was Herr Krause asking to borrow a hammer. Albert's heart stopped, not because the request was unusual, but because he had left the basement door slightly ajar. If Krause stepped inside, if he glanced down the hallway, he might see it. Albert forced a smile, told Krause to wait, and walked calmly to the door, closing it as he retrieved the hammer from a shed outside. The entire interaction lasted less than 3 minutes, but when Krause finally left, Albert's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold a cup of water. Downstairs, the Rosenfelds had heard the voices and frozen in absolute silence, the children holding their breath, the parents gripping each other in the dark. That night, Albert installed a lock on the basement door and rehearsed a cover story. If anyone ever asked, he would say he stored sensitive SS documents down there, files that required security. It was thin, but it was something. As the weeks turned into months, a grim routine took shape. Albert would leave for work before dawn, and the Rosenfelds would remain motionless in the basement until he returned after dark. He would bring them food, empty the waste buckets, and give them news of the outside world. Though the news was rarely good, the war was expanding, the deportations were accelerating. The camps were no longer a rumor, but a confirmed reality, and the stories filtering back were beyond comprehension. Albert did not share all of it with the Rosenfelds because he knew that hope, however fragile, was the only thing keeping them alive. But he also knew that every day the war continued. the odds of discovery grew. SS inspections were increasing. The Gestapo was cracking down on black market activity, which meant more raids, more searches, more excuses to enter homes unannounced. Albert was walking a tightrope, and the wind was starting to pick up. By the end of 1942, Albert Göring had become two people. During the day, he was the obedient soldier, the man in the black uniform who clicked his heels and raised his arm in salute. At night, he was the criminal, the traitor, the man who descended into his basement and whispered reassurances to a family that the Reich had condemned to death. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man trying not to drown in his own complicity. And every morning, when he looked at himself in the mirror before putting on that uniform, he asked the same question: how much longer can this last? The psychological toll on the Rosenfeld family was immense, and Albert watched it unfold with a helplessness that gnawed at him. The father, Jacob Rosenfeld, had been a tailor of some reputation, a man who prided himself on precision and craftsmanship. Now his hands had nothing to do. He sat in the dark for hours, running his fingers over the seams of his own clothes, a nervous habit that Albert noticed was wearing the fabric thin. The mother, Miriam, had been a pianist, and her silence was perhaps the cruelest punishment. She would sometimes move her fingers in the air as if playing invisible keys, her lips moving soundlessly to music only she could hear. The children suffered differently. The boy David, who had been 8 when they went into hiding, was now growing in the darkness, his body stretching but his world shrinking. The girl, Rachel, 12 when they descended, was entering adolescence in a tomb. There were no birthdays, no celebrations, no sunlight. Albert tried to bring them small comforts, a book here, a piece of chocolate there, but he knew these were drops in an ocean of deprivation. The worst part was the silence. They could not laugh, they could not cry loudly, they could not be human in the way humans need to be. Albert's own life above ground was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. His superiors at the SS had noticed his efficiency, and with that recognition came more responsibility. He was promoted to a position that required him to attend more meetings, file more reports, and spend more time away from home. This was dangerous for 2 reasons. First, it meant less time to care for the Rosenfelds, less time to bring them food and news, less time to monitor the house for threats. Second, it meant more scrutiny. Higher rank meant higher visibility, and higher visibility meant more colleagues visiting his home, more invitations to social gatherings, more expectations that he would participate in the social rituals of the SS. He had to decline most of these invitations without seeming antisocial or suspicious. He claimed he was caring for a sick relative, an aunt in the countryside who needed regular visits. It was a lie built on a foundation of other lies, and Albert knew that lies, like houses, eventually collapse under their own weight. The winter of 1942 into 1943 was brutal. Coal was rationed, and Albert could not risk using too much to heat his home without drawing attention. Upstairs, he kept the house cold enough to seem normal for wartime. Downstairs, the Rosenfelds shivered under thin blankets, their breath visible in the frozen air. Miriam developed a cough that she tried desperately to suppress, pressing a rag to her mouth whenever the spasms came. Albert brought her medicine when he could, but medicine was scarce, and asking for too much of it would raise questions. The children grew thinner. David's growth spurt meant he was always hungry, but there was never enough food. Rachel stopped menstruating, her body shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy. Albert saw all of this, and the guilt was suffocating. He had saved them from the camps, yes, but he was watching them die slowly in his basement, and he did not know which fate was worse. The second close call came in February of 1943, and it nearly ended everything. The Gestapo conducted a sweep of the neighborhood, searching for black market goods and draft dodgers. They went door to door, and when they arrived at Albert's house, he was not home. He was at work, 20 minutes away, when a neighbor's son ran to his office to tell him that men in leather coats were at his door. Albert's blood turned to ice. He left immediately, driving at a speed that drew honks and curses from other drivers, his mind racing through scenarios. If they searched the basement, it was over. If they heard even a whisper from below, it was over. When he arrived, the Gestapo men were still there, standing in his living room, rifling through his papers. Albert forced himself to stay calm. He greeted them with the proper salute, explained that he was an SS officer, and showed his credentials. One of the Gestapo agents, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, asked about the locked basement door. Albert delivered his rehearsed lie: sensitive documents, SS records, security protocol. The agent stared at him for what felt like an eternity, then nodded and moved on. They left 20 minutes later, finding nothing. Downstairs, the Rosenfelds had not moved a muscle for over an hour. That night, Albert sat on the floor of his kitchen and wept. Not from relief, but from the realization that this could not go on forever. The war was not ending. The Reich was not collapsing. If anything, the machinery of death was accelerating. And sooner or later, his luck would run out. But when he went downstairs that night and saw the faces of the Rosenfelds, pale and frightened but alive, he knew he could not stop. Not yet. Not while there was still breath in his body and a lock on that door. By the spring of 1943, the war had reached a turning point, though few in Germany were willing to admit it. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses at Stalingrad, and the invincibility of the Reich was beginning to crack. But this shift brought no relief to Albert Göring. If anything, it made his situation more precarious. As the war turned against Germany, paranoia within the SS intensified. There were purges of officers suspected of defeatism. There were investigations into loyalty. There were surprise inspections and mandatory party rallies where attendance was recorded and absences noted. Albert could feel the walls closing in, not because anyone suspected him specifically, but because the entire system was tightening like a noose. He attended every rally. He signed every loyalty oath. He performed his duties with mechanical precision, but inside, he was unraveling. The weight of living two lives, of being both executioner and savior, was breaking him piece by piece. The Rosenfelds were also changing. 365 days had passed since they entered the basement, and the psychological damage was becoming visible. Jacob had stopped speaking almost entirely. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing, his mind retreating into some interior space where Albert could not reach him. Miriam's cough had worsened despite the medicine, and she had grown gaunt, her cheekbones sharp against her pale skin. Rachel, now 13, had developed a habit of rocking back and forth, a self-soothing motion that she seemed unaware of. David, the youngest, had stopped asking when they could leave. He had accepted, in the way children do, that this darkness was now his world. Albert tried to give them hope, telling them that the Allies were advancing, that the war could not last forever, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. Hope required a future, and none of them could see past the next day. The third close call came in May, and it was the most dangerous yet. Albert's commanding officer, Hauptsturmführer Werner Koch, invited himself to Albert's home for dinner. It was not a request. It was an order disguised as a social courtesy. Koch was a true believer, a man who wore his SS uniform even on his days off, and who spoke of the final solution with pride. He was also suspicious by nature, the kind of officer who believed that vigilance was the highest virtue. Albert had no choice but to agree. He spent the entire day before the dinner in a state of controlled panic. He moved everything in the house that might seem unusual. He locked the basement door and placed a filing cabinet in front of it, making it look like storage. He instructed the Rosenfelds that no matter what they heard, no matter how long the evening lasted, they were to remain absolutely silent. That night, Koch arrived at 7, carrying a bottle of schnapps and wearing a smile that did not reach his eyes. The dinner was a nightmare. Herr Koch talked for hours, rambling about the war, about the inferiority of the Slavic races, about the necessity of exterminating the Jewish threat. Albert nodded, agreed, played the role of the loyal officer, but every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the house made his heart stop. At one point, Koch asked to use the bathroom, and Albert directed him upstairs, his hand trembling as he pointed the way. Koch was gone for 5 minutes, and in that time Albert imagined every possible disaster. What if Koch heard something? What if he opened the wrong door? What if the Rosenfelds coughed or moved? When Koch returned, he seemed satisfied, and Albert exhaled for the first time in an hour. The dinner finally ended at midnight, and Koch left with a handshake and a promise to visit again soon. Albert locked the door behind him, leaned against it and felt his legs give out. Downstairs, the Rosenfelds had heard every word. They had heard Koch's voice praising the camps. They had heard him laughing about the deportations, and they had heard Albert agreeing with him, playing his part. When Albert descended that night, Jacob looked at him with something Albert had never seen before, not gratitude, not trust, but doubt. And Albert understood. To the Rosenfelds, he was their savior, but he was also a man in an SS uniform who had just spent 4 hours celebrating their extermination. The line between who he pretended to be and who he was had become so thin that even Albert was no longer sure where one ended and the other began. The summer of 1943 brought a new kind of terror, one that Albert had not anticipated. The Allied bombing campaigns over Germany had intensified, and his city was now a target. Air raid sirens wailed at all hours, sending the population scrambling into public shelters and reinforced basements. For most Germans, the bombings were a source of fear and anger. For Albert, they were a logistical catastrophe. Every time the sirens sounded, his neighbors fled to the communal shelter 3 blocks away, and every time they expected Albert to join them. But Albert could not leave his house. If he went to the shelter, the Rosenfelds would be alone, vulnerable, and if a bomb hit the house, they would die trapped in the basement with no chance of escape. And if he stayed home during a raid, his absence from the shelter would be noticed, questioned, and reported. He was trapped between 2 impossible choices, and the bombs fell with increasing frequency. Albert developed a system, though it was fragile and desperate. When the sirens sounded during the day while he was at work, there was nothing he could do. He would sit in the SS bunker with his colleagues, listening to the explosions above, and pray that his house was not hit. When the sirens sounded at night, he would wait until his neighbors had left for the shelter, then descend into the basement and stay with the Rosenfelds. He would hold the children as the bombs fell, feeling the house shake with each impact, the walls groaning, dust falling from the ceiling. Miriam would pray in Hebrew, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Jacob would sit rigid, his hands gripping the edge of his chair, and Albert would count the seconds between explosions, calculating distance, wondering if the next one would be the one that buried them all. On 2 occasions, bombs landed close enough to shatter the windows upstairs and crack the foundation. On one occasion, a fire broke out 3 houses down, and Albert had to join the bucket brigade to put it out, leaving the Rosenfelds alone in the smoke-filled basement, choking and terrified. The bombings also brought a new danger, one that Albert had not foreseen. After each raid, officials would inspect the neighborhood for structural damage, checking basements and foundations to ensure buildings were safe. This meant strangers, city engineers and party officials, walking through homes, opening doors, asking questions. Albert could not refuse these inspections without arousing suspicion, so he had to find a way to hide the Rosenfelds even more completely. He built a false wall in the basement, a crude partition made of old wood and plaster that created a hidden space barely large enough for 4 people to stand. When inspectors came, the Rosenfelds would squeeze into this coffin-sized void, pressing their bodies together in total darkness, not breathing, not moving, while men walked just feet away on the other side. The first time this happened, Rachel fainted from lack of air, and Albert had to revive her afterward, her lips blue, her pulse weak. He knew this could not continue. The false wall was not soundproof. It was not airtight. It was a temporary solution to an impossible problem, and every inspection brought them closer to discovery. By August, the strain was visible on everyone. Albert had lost weight, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. His hands had developed a tremor that he could not control, and his superiors had begun to notice. One officer asked if he was ill, if he needed leave. Albert declined, knowing that leave would mean someone else watching his house, someone else asking questions. The Rosenfelds were deteriorating faster. Miriam's cough had turned chronic, a wet, rattling sound that she could no longer fully suppress. Jacob had stopped eating, pushing his meager portions toward the children. Rachel had begun pulling out her own hair, a nervous compulsion that left bald patches on her scalp. David, now 9, had stopped growing. His body, deprived of sunlight and nutrition, had simply given up. Albert brought them vitamins when he could, but vitamins could not replace hope, and hope was the one thing he could no longer provide. The 4th close call came in September, and it was the result of something Albert could never have predicted. A water pipe burst in the street outside his house, and city workers had to dig up the road to repair it. The work required them to access the underground pipes, which meant they needed to inspect every basement on the block to ensure there was no water damage. Albert was given 2 hours' notice. 2 hours to prepare for strangers to walk through his basement, to look at his walls, to check his foundation. 2 hours to decide whether to hide the Rosenfelds in the false wall and risk them suffocating, or to move them somewhere else, but where? There was nowhere else. Albert made the only choice he could. He hid them in the false wall, gave them a wet cloth to breathe through, and told them that no matter what, they could not make a sound. The inspection lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes of hell. And when it was over, when the workers finally left, Albert tore down the false wall with his bare hands and pulled the Rosenfelds out. They were unconscious, all 4 of them, their skin grey, their breathing shallow. He revived them one by one, and when they finally opened their eyes, he saw something in their faces that terrified him more than the Gestapo, more than the bombs. He saw resignation. They were starting to give up. The autumn of 1943 arrived with a cold that seemed to seep into the bones of the city, and with it came a shift in the war that even the most loyal party members could no longer ignore. The Allies had invaded Italy, and Mussolini had fallen. The Red Army was pushing westward, reclaiming territory mile by bloody mile. In Berlin, the propaganda machine worked overtime to maintain morale, but the cracks were showing. Food rations were cut again. Coal was nearly impossible to obtain. The cities were grey with ash and despair. For Albert, these developments meant 2 things. First, the end of the war was no longer a fantasy, but a distant possibility, though how distant he could not say. Second, the SS was becoming more vicious, more desperate, more willing to lash out at anyone suspected of disloyalty. Officers were being arrested on the flimsiest of pretexts. Neighbors were informing on neighbors with renewed zeal. The machine was eating itself, and Albert was standing right in its jaws. The Rosenfelds had now been in the basement for 2 years, and the physical and mental toll had become catastrophic. Miriam's cough had evolved into something far worse, a lung infection that left her feverish and delirious. She would wake in the night calling out names of people long dead, her voice loud enough to make Albert's heart stop. He brought her antibiotics, stolen from the SS medical supplies, but the infection was deep and stubborn. Jacob had retreated so far into himself that he barely acknowledged Albert's presence anymore. He would sit in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers in a language Albert did not understand. Rachel, now 14, had stopped speaking entirely. She communicated only through gestures, her eyes empty and distant. David was the only one who still seemed to have fight left in him, but even that was fading. He would ask Albert questions about the outside world, about the sun, about trees, about things he could barely remember. And Albert would answer, painting pictures with words of a world that felt as distant to him as it did to the boy. Albert's own mental state was deteriorating in ways he had not anticipated. He had begun to experience what he could only describe as dissociation, moments where he felt like he was watching himself from outside his own body. He would be sitting in an SS meeting, nodding along to discussions of deportation quotas and labor camp logistics, and suddenly he would feel like he was not really there, like he was a ghost, haunting his own life. At night, he would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to think, unable to feel anything but a numb exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. He had stopped shaving regularly. He had stopped caring about his appearance. His uniform was wrinkled, his boots unpolished. Other officers noticed, and one even pulled him aside to ask if he was drinking. Albert denied it, but the truth was worse than alcoholism. He was simply running out of the ability to pretend. The 5th close call came in October, and it was the one that nearly broke him. The Gestapo launched a city-wide operation targeting black market networks, and as part of the sweep, they conducted random searches of SS officers' homes to ensure that no one was abusing their position for personal gain. Albert received the notice on a Thursday morning. They would arrive on Saturday at 10 in the morning. He had less than 48 hours to prepare. The problem was that there was no way to prepare. The false wall had been dismantled after the water inspection. The basement was too small to hide 4 people without some kind of partition, and even if he rebuilt it, the Rosenfelds were too weak to endure another confinement in that airless space. Albert considered for the first time the possibility of surrender. He thought about simply opening the door when the Gestapo arrived and letting them find the family. At least then it would be over. At least then he could stop pretending. But when he went downstairs that night and saw Miriam's fevered face, Jacob's hollow eyes, Rachel's silent stare, and David's small hand reaching out to touch his, he knew he could not give up. Not yet. Albert spent Friday night rebuilding the false wall, working by lamplight, his hands bleeding from splinters, his body shaking with exhaustion. He made it thicker this time, double-layered, with a small air vent disguised as a crack in the foundation. When he finished at dawn, he brought the Rosenfelds to the hidden space and explained what would happen. They would have to stay inside for as long as the search lasted. They would have to control their breathing. They would have to trust him one more time. Miriam, barely conscious, nodded. Jacob said nothing. Rachel closed her eyes. David squeezed Albert's hand and whispered the first words Albert had heard from him in weeks. He said thank you, and then Albert sealed them inside, climbed the stairs, put on his uniform, and waited for the knock on the door. The knock came at exactly 10 in the morning, sharp and authoritative, the kind of knock that announced power without needing to say a word. Albert opened the door to find 3 Gestapo agents standing on his doorstep, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in the long leather coats that had become synonymous with terror. The lead agent, a man named Standartenführer Ernst Hoffmann, was someone Albert recognized from SS gatherings, a cold-eyed bureaucrat known for his thoroughness. Hoffmann did not smile. He simply presented the search warrant, a single typed page with the official seal of the Reich, and walked past Albert into the house without waiting for an invitation. The other 2 agents followed, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Albert's heart was pounding so hard he was certain they could hear it, but he kept his face neutral, his posture correct, his voice steady, as he asked if there was a specific reason for the search. Hoffmann replied that there was no specific reason. This was routine, this was policy. And then he told Albert to remain in the living room while they conducted their inspection. The next hour was the longest of Albert's life. He sat on the couch, his hands folded in his lap, listening to the sounds of the agents moving through his house. He heard drawers opening, closets being searched, floorboards being tested for hollow spaces. He heard them upstairs, moving through his bedroom, his bathroom, his small study, and then he heard the sound he had been dreading. Footsteps descending the stairs to the basement. His entire body went rigid. He wanted to stand, to follow them, to control the situation, but he knew that would only make him look suspicious. So he sat, and he waited, and he prayed to a God he was no longer sure he believed in. Downstairs, behind the false wall, the Rosenfelds were holding their breath. Miriam's fever had spiked that morning, and she was trembling uncontrollably, her body fighting an infection that was slowly killing her. Jacob had his arms around her, holding her still, his own body a cage to keep her silent. Rachel and David were pressed against the wall, their eyes closed, their hands clasped together. They could hear the voices of the agents muffled but close, discussing the layout of the basement, the age of the foundation, the dampness of the walls. One of the agents, the woman, noticed the false wall immediately. She called Hoffmann over, pointing to the seam where the new wood met the old plaster. Albert, still sitting upstairs, heard her voice and felt his blood turn to ice. He heard Hoffmann ask a question, something about renovations, and then he heard footsteps ascending the stairs. Hoffmann appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, and asked Albert when he had done work on the basement. Albert's mind raced. He could not say he had not done any work, because the evidence was right there. He could not say it was recent, because that would invite more questions. So he lied. He said he had reinforced the wall 2 years ago, after a minor flood, to prevent water damage. He said it was shoddy work, done quickly, and he had been meaning to hire a professional but had not had the time. Hoffmann stared at him for what felt like an eternity, then nodded and returned to the basement. Albert heard him tell the other agents to check the wall for structural integrity. He heard them tapping on it, testing its strength. And then he heard the sound that nearly stopped his heart. A cough, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. The basement went silent. Albert could hear nothing, not even the sound of breathing, and that silence was worse than any noise. He stood up, his body moving on instinct, and walked to the top of the basement stairs. Hoffman was standing at the bottom, his head tilted, listening. The other two agents had stopped moving. The woman had her hand on her sidearm. Albert forced himself to speak, his voice calm, almost bored. He said that the pipes in the basement sometimes made strange noises, especially in the cold weather, a rattling sound that echoed through the walls. He said it had been happening for months, and he had reported it to the city, but no one had come to fix it. Hoffman looked at him, then looked back at the wall. He tapped it once more, hard, and the sound reverberated through the space. Behind the wall, the Rosenfelds did not move. They did not breathe. They did not exist. And after a moment that stretched into forever, Hoffman turned away. He told the other agents they were done. He walked up the stairs past Albert and out the front door without another word. Albert stood at the top of the stairs for 5 minutes after they left, unable to move, unable to think. His legs felt like water. His vision was blurred. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a deafening drum that drowned out everything else. Finally, he descended the stairs, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the railing. He dismantled the false wall piece by piece, and when he finally pulled the last board away, he saw the Rosenfelds collapsed in a heap, their bodies entangled, their faces pale. Miriam was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Jacob was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking. Rachel and David were holding each other, their eyes wide and unfocused. Albert pulled them out one by one, laying them on the basement floor, and then he sat down beside them and put his head in his hands. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply sat there, in the cold and the dark, and realized that they could not survive another search. The luck had run out. The next time they would all die. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was the darkest period of the entire ordeal, not because of any single catastrophic event, but because of the slow, grinding realization that survival was no longer a matter of luck or skill, but of sheer endurance against impossible odds. Miriam's condition had worsened to the point where she could no longer stand. Her lung infection had spread, and without proper medical care, Albert knew she was dying. He stole morphine from the SS medical supplies, enough to ease her pain, but not enough to cure her. She spent her days in a fevered half-sleep, mumbling in Yiddish, calling out for her mother, for her childhood home, for a world that no longer existed. Jacob sat beside her, holding her hand, his face a mask of grief. He had stopped eating entirely, and Albert could see his body wasting away, his skin hanging loose over his bones. Rachel and David had withdrawn into themselves, two ghosts haunting the basement, their eyes empty, their movements slow and mechanical. Albert brought them food, but they barely touched it. He brought them books, but they did not read. He brought them news of the war, of the Allied advances, of the possibility of liberation, but they no longer believed him. Albert himself was unraveling in ways he could no longer hide. His superiors had noticed his deterioration and had begun asking questions. His performance reviews were declining. His attendance at party functions was inconsistent. His appearance was disheveled. One officer, a man named Obersturmführer Klaus Becker, pulled him aside after a briefing and asked him directly if he was having a nervous breakdown. Albert denied it, but Becker was not convinced. He suggested that Albert take medical leave, that he see a doctor, that he consider a transfer to a less demanding post. Albert refused, knowing that any of those options would mean losing control of his house, losing access to the basement, losing the ability to protect the Rosenfelds. But his refusal only deepened the suspicion. Becker began watching him more closely, asking more questions, appearing at his home unannounced under the pretense of friendly visits. Albert could feel the net tightening, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before someone discovered the truth. The sixth close call came in January of 1944, and it was the result of something Albert had no control over. A neighbor's child, a boy of 10 named Hans, had been playing in the street when he claimed to have heard voices coming from Albert's basement. The boy told his mother, who told Herr Krause, who reported it to the block warden. The block warden, a officious man named Friedrich Lange, came to Albert's door the next day and demanded to inspect the basement. Albert's mind went blank. He could not refuse without confirming the suspicion. He could not allow the inspection without revealing the Rosenfelds. He was trapped. And then, in a moment of desperate improvisation, Albert did something he had never done before. He used his rank. He told Lange that the basement contained classified SS materials related to an ongoing investigation, and that unauthorized access was a violation of Reich security protocol. He said it with such authority, such cold bureaucratic menace, that Lange hesitated. Albert pressed the advantage. He asked Lange if he wanted to be responsible for compromising an SS operation. He asked if Lange understood the consequences of interfering with classified work. And Lange, a man whose entire identity was built on obedience to authority, backed down. He apologized. He left. But Albert knew that the reprieve was temporary. Lange would report the incident to his superiors, and eventually, someone with more authority than Albert would come asking questions. That night, Albert made a decision that he had been avoiding for months. He had to find a way to get the Rosenfelds out of the basement, out of his house, out of Germany entirely. But how? The borders were sealed, the trains were monitored, the entire country was a prison. And yet Albert knew that staying was no longer an option. The searches were becoming more frequent. The suspicions were growing. Miriam was dying, and the rest of the family was not far behind. If they remained in the basement, they would all die, either from disease, discovery, or despair. Albert began making inquiries, careful, indirect questions, to people he thought might have connections to resistance networks or smuggling operations. He used his SS credentials to access files on border patrols, looking for weaknesses, gaps in coverage, times when security was relaxed. He was playing a dangerous game, and he knew that one wrong move would expose not only the Rosenfelds but himself. But he also knew that doing nothing was a death sentence, and so for the first time in 3 years, Albert Göring began to plan not just for survival, but for escape. The plan began to take shape in February. Albert had made contact through a series of intermediaries with a man who claimed to have connections to a smuggling route through Switzerland. The man, whose name Albert never learned, said he could move people across the border for a price. The price was astronomical, more money than Albert had, but he began selling everything he owned: his father's watch, his mother's jewelry, books, furniture, anything of value. He withdrew his savings, cashed in bonds, and even stole from SS funds, covering his tracks with falsified reports. By March, he had enough. The smuggler agreed to take the Rosenfelds, but there was a catch. They had to be able to walk. They had to be strong enough to travel 50 kilometers on foot through the mountains. And as Albert looked at the 4 skeletal figures in his basement, Miriam barely conscious, Jacob emaciated, Rachel and David hollow-eyed and weak, he realized that they were not ready. They might never be ready. But they had no choice. The plan was set for April, and Albert prayed that they would all live long enough to see it through. April of 1944 arrived with a false spring, warm days that melted the last of the snow and gave the illusion that the world might be healing. But for Albert and the Rosenfelds, time was running out in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Miriam had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer speak coherently. Her body was failing, and Albert knew that moving her in her condition was tantamount to killing her. But leaving her behind was not an option. The smuggler had been clear: all 4 or none, no exceptions. Albert spent every night for 2 weeks trying to build up their strength, bringing them extra food he had stockpiled, vitamins he had hoarded, anything that might give them a chance. He made them walk short distances at first, back and forth across the basement, building their endurance. Jacob could barely stand. Rachel moved like a sleepwalker. David tried his best, but his legs trembled after just a few steps. And Miriam simply lay on the floor, her breathing shallow, her eyes unfocused. Albert realized with a cold certainty that they were not going to make it. But the date was set. The smuggler would be waiting on April 15th at midnight at a farm 20 kilometers outside the city. And if they did not show, there would be no second chance. The days leading up to the escape were a blur of preparation and terror. Albert had to request leave from his duties, claiming a family emergency, a story that was met with skepticism but ultimately approved. He gathered supplies, warm clothes, water, food, medicine, everything they would need for the journey. He studied maps, memorizing routes, backup plans, places to hide if they were spotted. He rehearsed the story they would tell if they were stopped, a lie about relocating workers to a labor camp, paperwork he had forged using stolen SS documents. Every detail had to be perfect because there would be no room for error. On the night of April 14th, Albert brought the Rosenfelds upstairs for the first time in 2 years and 7 months. They stood in his living room, blinking in the dim lamplight, their bodies swaying, disoriented by the space by the ceiling above their heads, by the simple act of standing on a floor that was not damp concrete. Miriam collapsed immediately, and Albert had to carry her to the couch. Jacob wept. Rachel stared at the walls as if they were hallucinations. David reached out and touched the window, his fingers trembling against the glass, and whispered that he had forgotten what glass felt like. They left at 11 that night, moving through the empty streets like shadows. Albert had timed their departure to coincide with the changing of the night patrols, a 15-minute window when the streets were least monitored. He carried Miriam in his arms, her body so light it terrified him. Jacob leaned on Rachel, who leaned on David, the three of them forming a chain of mutual support. They moved slowly, painfully, every step an agony. Twice they had to stop and hide when they heard voices, pressing themselves into doorways, holding their breath. Once a patrol car passed within 10 meters, its headlights sweeping across the street, and Albert was certain they had been seen. But the car kept moving, and they kept walking. It took them 2 hours to reach the edge of the city, a journey that should have taken 30 minutes. By the time they reached the rendezvous point, a dilapidated barn on the outskirts of a farm, Miriam was unconscious, and Jacob had collapsed twice. The smuggler was waiting, a wiry man in his 50s with a face that betrayed no emotion. He looked at the Rosenfelds, then at Albert, and shook his head. He said they would never make it. They were too weak, too sick. The journey through the mountains required stamina, speed, and silence, and these people had none of those things. Albert pulled the smuggler aside, his voice urgent, desperate. He offered more money, double the agreed price, everything he had left. The smuggler considered, then agreed, but with a condition. If any of them slowed the group down, if any of them made noise that attracted patrols, he would leave them behind. No exceptions, no sentiment. Survival was not a charity. Albert agreed, because he had no other choice. The group set out at 1 in the morning, moving through the forest on paths that barely existed, trails used by deer and smugglers, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. The journey was brutal. The terrain was steep, the ground uneven, the darkness absolute. Miriam had to be carried on a makeshift stretcher, a blanket tied between 2 branches, with Albert and the smuggler taking turns bearing the weight. Jacob stumbled constantly, his body giving out every few hundred meters. Rachel and David held hands, moving in silence, their faces blank with exhaustion. They walked for 6 hours without stopping, and by dawn they had covered less than half the distance. The smuggler said they were moving too slowly. He said that at this pace they would be caught before they reached the border. And then he looked at Miriam, still unconscious on the stretcher, and said what Albert had been dreading. He said she was not going to survive the journey. He said they should leave her. And Albert, for the first time in 3 years, said no. What happened next would define the rest of Albert's life. He told the smuggler to take Jacob, Rachel, and David ahead. He said he would stay with Miriam, that he would find another way, that he would not abandon her after bringing her this far. The smuggler shrugged, indifferent, and turned to leave. Jacob refused to go. He said he would stay with his wife. Rachel and David clung to their parents, sobbing, begging not to be separated. And for a moment, the entire plan collapsed into chaos. 4 people who had survived 3 years in darkness, now fracturing under the weight of an impossible choice. It was Miriam who ended it. She opened her eyes, her voice a whisper, and told Jacob to go. She told him to take the children. She told him that she was dying, that she had been dying for months, and that her death should not be theirs. Jacob refused, but Miriam insisted, her hand gripping his with a strength that seemed impossible. She told him that she loved him. She told him that he had to live. And then she closed her eyes and let go. Jacob, Rachel, and David left with the smuggler, disappearing into the forest, their sobs echoing through the trees. Albert stayed with Miriam, holding her hand, watching the sun rise over the mountains. She died an hour later, peacefully, her suffering finally over, and Albert buried her there, in a shallow grave beneath a pine tree, marking the spot with a cairn of stones. Then he turned back toward Germany, toward the city, toward the uniform he had abandoned, and walked into the unknown. Albert Göring never made it back to his home. He walked for 3 days through the countryside, avoiding main roads, sleeping in barns, drinking from streams, his SS uniform abandoned in a ditch. He knew that returning to his post would mean immediate arrest. His absence had been noted, his house had been searched. And by now, the Gestapo would have discovered the evidence he had left behind. The false wall, the makeshift living space, the unmistakable signs that someone had been hidden there for years. Albert was a wanted man, a traitor to the Reich, and his life as an SS officer was over. He eventually made contact with a resistance cell operating in the region, and through them, he learned that Jacob, Rachel, and David had made it across the Swiss border. They were alive. They were safe. And that knowledge, that single piece of information, was the only thing that kept Albert from surrendering to despair. He spent the final year of the war moving from safe house to safe house, helping the resistance in small ways, forging documents, smuggling information, doing whatever he could to atone for the 3 years he had spent wearing the uniform of the SS. When the war ended in May of 1945, Albert was arrested by Allied forces, not as a war criminal, but as a former SS officer whose record needed to be examined. The interrogation lasted for months. Albert told them everything. He told them about the Rosenfelds. He told them about the basement. He told them about the searches, the bombings, the near discoveries, the desperate escape. The Allied officers did not believe him at first. The story was too extraordinary, too convenient, too perfectly designed to absolve an SS officer of guilt. But then they found Jacob Rosenfeld. He was living in a displaced persons camp in Switzerland, along with Rachel and David, waiting for permission to emigrate to America. Jacob testified on Albert's behalf. He described the basement, the 3 years of darkness, the terror, the near misses, the night Albert had carried Miriam through the forest. He showed them the scars, the psychological damage, the evidence that his story was true. Rachel and David confirmed everything. The Allied tribunal reviewed the case and concluded that Albert Göring had committed no war crimes. In fact, they determined that he had risked his life to save a Jewish family at a time when doing so was punishable by death. He was released without charges, a free man in a world that no longer had a place for him. Albert spent the rest of his life in obscurity. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. He never sought recognition or reward. He moved to a small town in Austria, changed his name and worked as a carpenter, a quiet man who kept to himself and never mentioned the war. Jacob, Rachel, and David emigrated to the United States in 1947, settling in New York, where Jacob reopened his tailor shop and tried to rebuild the life that had been stolen from him. They stayed in contact with Albert through letters, brief notes sent across the ocean, expressions of gratitude that could never fully capture the debt they owed. Rachel became a teacher. David became a doctor. They married, had children, built lives that Miriam had died to make possible. And every year on the anniversary of their escape, they would light a candle for Miriam, and for Albert, the man in the SS uniform who had chosen humanity over ideology, decency over duty, and had paid for that choice with everything he had. Albert Göring died in 1973 alone in a small apartment in Vienna. He was 68 years old. His death was noted in a single paragraph in a local newspaper, a brief mention of a retired carpenter with no surviving family. There was no mention of the war, no mention of the SS, no mention of the Rosenfelds. His story remained buried, known only to a handful of people, until decades later when historians began piecing together the fragmented records of the Holocaust and discovered his name in Jacob's testimony. Today, Albert Göring is remembered, if he is remembered at all, as a footnote in history, a strange anomaly, an SS officer who saved Jews. But his story is more than that. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, even in the heart of the most evil system ever created, there were individuals who chose to resist, not with grand gestures or heroic speeches, but with quiet acts of defiance that cost them everything. Albert Göring hid a family in his basement for 3 years, not because he was a saint, but because he was a human being who refused to look away. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson his story can teach us. So why was this story forgotten? Why is Albert Göring not a household name like Oskar Schindler or Raoul Wallenberg? The answer is uncomfortable. Albert wore the uniform of the SS, and that uniform carries a stain that no amount of heroism can fully wash away. The world is not comfortable with moral complexity. We want our heroes to be pure and our villains to be absolute. Albert Göring was neither. He was a man who participated in a monstrous system and then betrayed it, a man who saved lives while wearing the insignia of death. His story does not fit neatly into the narratives we tell ourselves about the Holocaust, and so it has been largely ignored, tucked away in archives, mentioned briefly in academic papers, but never celebrated. But his story deserves to be told, not to absolve the SS of its crimes, but to remind us that morality is not a uniform, it is a choice. And Albert Göring made his choice, in the darkness of his basement with a family who would have died without him. That choice matters, that story matters, and now you know it too.